inflation, public sector strikes, tax rises, and one policy that doesn't sound like it's from the 1970s, the online safety bill. All tonight on Live Without Littlewood. Kaboom, kapow, welcome to Live Without Littlewood. I'm Alex Dean, standing in for Mark Littlewood, and I have truly committed myself to the role this evening. In the run-up to tonight's show, I've opened 3 new online gambling accounts. I've reread my Hayek cover to cover. I've committed my soul to Southampton Football Club. I even found myself talking a bit like this for a while, but quite annoying that was too. I truly am Mark's stunt double for this evening, and joining me on the wild ride of Live Without Littlewood, I'm delighted to be joined by Victoria Hewson from the IEA, who's going to be talking to us about tax and regulation and why is a Conservative government experiencing quite such high levels of taxation in our country. We'll be joined by Mark Johnson from Big Brother Watch, an organisation that has always been led by people of phenomenal, even distracting attractiveness, who's going to be talking to us about the online safety bill. And I'm going to be joined by the homegrown Chris Snowdon, very own IEA, David Beckham from the Academy, all the way through man and boy IEA talent, who's going to be talking to us about maybe on lifestyle economics, the government's not got it all wrong. We'll be listening to that with some interest. But first of all, I'm delighted to be joined by Alys Denby, Deputy Editor at CapX.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm disappointed I didn't get an introduction about my attractiveness.
Well, I know it was slightly self-serving because I used to run Big Brother Watch, I admit it. Last week, rail strikes in the United Kingdom. The team here at the IEA have assembled me some of the potential threatened strikes in our future. Royal Mail, the doctors, British Airways holding up the airports, firefighters. Where are we and what's going on with this kind of public sector and private sector strike threats?
I think it's obviously we're at a period of inflation. It's understandable that public sector workers want to see their pay keep pace with the actual cost of living. But the question really for me is this reasonable at a time when people in the private sector are not getting 7, 10, 30% pay rises apparently the GPs are asking for? And I think I take the same line as the Justice Lord Burnett, who said that barristers who went on strike at a time when the court is having these huge backlogs of rape cases, murders, child abuse, that any barrister who goes on strike to hold that up should be referred for professional misconduct. And I think the same should be said of other public sector workers, doctors, GPs who want to go on strike at this moment.
So I declare an interest because I'm a recovering barrister. I think the profession would say that many junior barristers in the criminal bar are working for less than minimum wage, and not just a bit, but habitually and year after year. Any sympathy?
Absolutely. I have sympathy with everyone who's experiencing a massive squeeze on their living standards. We're all going through it. But what I do think is frankly unprofessional when you're in a job where you've taken professional oaths, you owe a duty to your clients, and society holds you in a particularly high regard, and because of the kind of status that you've accorded, to go on strike is just completely irresponsible.
Now, I suppose the worst strike we could contemplate would be one in the medical sphere, where people already facing this incredible backlog on operations might find themselves having to wait even longer for something. I mean, it must be very frightening if you've already had to have this wait and you're in the NHS's enormous backlog, and to be told the doctor might be on strike and be even further. So even the threat of a strike might disturb people. But I think I know what the answer is. But your view on a medical strike?
Absolutely unconscionable and a disgrace to the profession if it happens. Doctors who, people have waited long enough during the pandemic, they've suffered enough, and doctors, it's terrible for all of us, but they have actually had pretty good pay rises. They've got incredible job security, much better than many other people. And they have a duty, above everyone else in society, I think, to their patients.
And what about public sector pensions? Because the answer used to be that if you were in the public sector, you had lower wages, but your pension was better, and it sort of balanced out. Now it seems they've got just as good pensions, just as good wages, or better than the private sector, and, as you say, even more job security. So do you think, just taking the public sector more broadly, is there any of those guys who've been arguing that they've lost so much over RPI over recent years, take the postal workers and so forth, people who are kind of pretty lowly paid, and say they deserve a pay rise? Your position is, especially at this time, get on with it?
I mean, I think there's one argument about whether people deserve a pay rise. That's different to the argument about whether it's justifiable to go on strike to demand one.
So let's figure that out. Do you think that some of this is bluster, taking a position to try to make people think they might go out?
I think some of it is bluff and bluster, some of it is essentially fairly militant trade unions on a political mission, and some of it is, it's the trade union's job to stand up for their members, isn't it? But frankly, trade union membership is in a long-term decline. It's been going up a bit, but the long-term trend is downwards. And private sector workers, as I say, are not having these kind of pay rises.
Do you think membership is going up because they're being more militant?
Almost certainly, yeah. And because people's wages are suffering and they see, an opportunity to get a better deal.
So let's take the freedom-minded perspective on the question. So that's been the kind of thinking about it as consumers of these services. What about the libertarian perspective? And aren't these people entitled to withdraw their labour? Nobody's entitled to force you to work?
Sure, they're entitled to go on strike, but do we as a society have to stand up for that and say, that's fair enough and that's a responsible thing to do?
So the ultimate thing, though, is if you're going to call their bluff, you've got to be willing to sack them, right? And you've got to be willing to say, I'm going to replace you. It's what Ronald Reagan did with the air traffic controllers. Pretty hard to do with doctors, I would have thought.
Yes, very hard to do, especially when we've got an enormous number of vacancies. I think there are other things that the government should do. For example, it's absolutely ludicrous that we've got a cap on the number of medical school places when we have such an enormous need for doctors. And obviously there's always the kind of immigration lever that we can pull. But you're right, the government's in a bind because it can't just sack doctors.
And even if you did have a freer market in healthcare education, the nature of qualification is such it would take years for them to come into the system, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's a real difficulty. But we have seen in the past that the government can stand firm. For example, with the junior doctors' strike, if you do take a firm stance, eventually, you can win. You don't have to just fold. And I think for a Conservative government, the issue is always, well, a Labour government is always going to be in a better position than you to make deals with a trade union, frankly, because they're going to be more willing to just concede. So politically, as well as economically, the Conservatives always have a kind of responsibility to kind of stand firm in these kind of debates, I think.
Traditionally, people have, in this country, we love the NHS. It's almost like a national religion. Not long ago, we were on our doorsteps clapping as a country for the NHS during coronavirus. Do you think that the healthcare profession might have misjudged the mood on this a little bit?
I would hope so. I mean, I'm sure people in this room and watching this don't need to have too many lessons about the nature of the kind of national religion of the NHS and how damaging that is policy-wise. And I would hope that, especially if people start to experience backlogs upon backlogs, delays upon delays to their healthcare, everyone in this, you can't get an appointment with a GP at the moment. Eventually, something's going to have to break, right? And we're going to have to stop just regarding everyone who decides to work for the NHS as a saint.
I think one of the issues that you've put your finger on is the situation in this country where there's almost no choice to go somewhere else. Unless you're a wealthy person, you're not in a position to take something other than the NHS's provision for healthcare. But there is competition in some other markets. And if people go, don't you think, when we have strikes in London and the black cabbies try and hold up the streets to demand better conditions for themselves, in the end they encourage people to use other services. I think over time strikes are counterproductive?
Absolutely. And I also think that there's an element of inevitability about it. So if you look at the railways, for example, they're going to have to modernise. They're going to make themselves obsolete in the end anyway, and strikes merely advance the kind of natural progression. I do think that during the pandemic, many parents who could afford it have switched, for example, to private education, noticing how much better the provision is there. And yes, I do think ultimately these are counterproductive. And I think if you want to have the sort of, as I said before, the kind of social status and the cachet and the respect that society accords professional people whose services we rely on, then you have to act in a professional way. You've got a higher duty.
Alys, robust start as we expected from CapX. Stay with us, please, as we're joined by the IEA's Head of Regulatory Affairs, Victoria Hewson. Victoria, hi, thanks for coming on. We're going to talk inflation, but first of all, as we were discussing strikes, your views?
I agree that for key public sector workers it's unconscionable to go on strike. What I think is also unconscionable is the way that a Conservative government that's been in power, whether in coalition or with an outright majority, for, what are we up to now, 12 years, hasn't done anything to reform the laws around strikes and trade union activity, as well as all of the working practices that rather politically incorrectly get called Spanish practices that have come to light in connection with the railway workers as well.
So when you're on a go slow, so as not to, more than my job's worth, I'm going to take 12 minutes to walk to the restroom before lunch starts, or at least claim I do.
Yes, and restricting the ability of teams to work in different locations.
I was astonished to find that the guys who work on the Euston line can't go over and help on the King's Cross line if there's an issue, even if they're not doing anything, and even if it's seriously going to hold up the transport system.
But to be honest, I think, again, as Alys alluded to, I think it's ultimately counterproductive for the workers in the railways. The sort of outworking of the coronavirus pandemic policies and the general shutdown led to a collapse in passenger numbers using the railways that hasn't recovered to anywhere like its pre-pandemic levels. And, query whether the now rather prevalent popularity of hybrid working means that are they ever going to recover to those same levels? Is our current railway network sustainable as it is at present? And, are the workers who are campaigning against and holding back the kinds of modernisations and efficiencies that might give the railways a fighting chance of being a useful transport network into the coming decades? I'm afraid by resisting all of that kind of thing, they might just be pricing themselves out of sustainable jobs.
Well, of course, I note that the railways took billions of public money to keep them going, and this might seem to some people a strange time to ask for a pay rise. But anyway, I want to talk to you about inflation. Look at where we are now. Not just food and energy costs that have gone up, all other goods risen by average 8% over the past 2 years. What's the IEA's perspective on what should be happening here, and can we get out of a spiral where inflation's going up, goods cost more, people want bigger pay rises, and so forth?
Well, the IEA... Our writers have been rather smug about this because our experts like Tim Congdon have been sounding the alarm about the upcoming threat of inflation for a couple of years now. Now, arguably, people who sort of favour sound money and disfavour loose monetary policy could have easily seen this coming. By the influx of money into the economy that hasn't been backed by productivity, too much money chasing too few goods and services. I think.
And debt's very cheap.
And cheap debt. The legacy of quantitative easing in economies, not just ours, of course. And I think, to be fair, the vast stimulus packages in the United States, multi-trillion-dollar stimulus packages, does have an effect on the global economy as well. That all seeps in. The war in Ukraine, hitting energy prices and supply chains. China's continued lockdowns causing all of that blockages in supply chains and cargo getting out of Shanghai. All of those things. But I don't think we can let our government off the hook and let the Chancellor off the hook here by just allowing, and the Bank of England in particular, by just allowing them to throw their hands in the air and say, oh, global forces, what could we do? I think they have to take some responsibility here because they should have seen this coming and they should have been acting more sensibly sooner.
Alys, Victoria's set the stage very well for why we are where we are. What's your CapX, CPS position on what we should do now? Is it time for tax cuts? Is it time for government to borrow more? Is it something else?
I think the CPS position is that we should look at every single thing on in the legislative books and see, is it costing consumers money?
Cut spending.
Cut spending, cut taxes. I think it's absolutely the wrong time for a national insurance rise. It's absolutely the wrong time for corporation tax hike, unpopular as that might be. The best way to help people with the cost of living is to let them keep more of their own money in their own pockets. And the government just doesn't seem to be up for it.
And supply-side reforms to enable that productivity to catch up with the money supply, which unfortunately, in many respects, the government is going backwards on that.
And what would your supply-side reforms be?
Well, for a start, we're going to get onto the online safety bill in a moment. That's not just a threat to freedom of speech, but it's also going to be very costly for businesses to comply with, and will ultimately deter startups and entrepreneurs from getting involved in those kinds of digital markets. We've seen a rather weak and feeble proposal for reforming data protection law, which we know the GDPR has had extremely negative effects on innovation and competition in those really vital digital markets and research. It's been greatly beneficial for the digital giants who have deep pockets to pay for all of this compliance costs and already have strong market positions. Unfortunately, the government has really ducked out of doing a proper end-to-end review of those kinds of regulations. Financial services review of the future financial framework, I think it's called, is plodding along very slowly, but the kinds of reforms that businesses were looking for, to things like Solvency II, to inject capital into the productive sectors of the economy, is happening at an absolute snail's pace.
And Alys, you were going to say?
Yeah, so one more supply-side reform that I can never stop talking enough about is childcare costs. So I'm at the very sharpest end of this. I've got a child under 3, so I get no help at all from the government, and she's at nursery 4 days a week, and it costs 70% of my income.
Good grief.
Basically, it means that my...
After tax.
So basically it means my husband sort of subsidises CapX to employ me, which doesn't feel like a very feminist position to be in. So absolutely, the government's talked about reforming the ratios to adults to children. It should
That's
also
allowing more children per adult childminder or childcare.
Yeah, absolutely. This is only to bring it into line with, say, Scotland and other European countries. So safety arguments I don't think fly on that at all. And then there's also the early years foundation framework, so it's a curriculum for 2-year-olds.
Which is just bureaucracy, really.
It's just bureaucracy. It has things like, there's a set text that's the very hungry caterpillar. It's laughable. It's just a form-filling exercise for preschool teachers. So that is a supply-side reform that we cannot
And Dara,
get
can I just quickly squeeze in planning reform to really get more workers and into the places that are productive, and to allow more families to actually buy their own home.
To own their own home, which you would think would be in the Conservative Party's interests, because when you divide up the electorate in all manner of ways, one of the clearest for them is homeowners are more likely to vote Tory.
Exactly.
So even if you were just thinking about it from a naked,
Tactically,
self-interested perspective. You both set out some very interesting points about supply-side reforms, regulatory activity. It seems to me, and I welcome both your views, that a lot of these regulations are welcomed by the industry because they act as a barrier to entry. They act as something that stymies competition and prevents newcomers coming in with new ideas, cheaper products, threaten the market position of the big incumbents. Alys first, is that fair?
Yeah.
Victoria?
I think that's very common. I think a very common sort of path through this kind of thing is that often the industry might oppose a particular regulation. The great example of this was the REACH regulation for chemicals, which was tremendously costly and complex to implement, literally cost tens of billions to the industry to implement it. So the industry bodies were pretty resistant about it 10, 20 years ago when it was in development and being passed in law in the EU. But then once they've spent those billions, it's then in their interest. That's a sunk cost. They're not going to get that back. And it then becomes a barrier to entry to challengers and overseas competitors. So now the industry is very devoted to the REACH regulation.
I think, sometimes you get consumer groups as well. Sorry, going back to childcare, which there's a lot of kind of consumer campaign groups that also oppose loosening regulations because they make claims about safety and quality of childcare, but what they don't seem to recognise is that it's so expensive that many people just can't afford anything at all. So yeah, I think there's lots of barriers in the way to the kind of reforms we want to see.
Well, if you're watching, we've 20 minutes in, and the reason that you're still watching is it's very good. So like, comment and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and please check out and support our digital content through our Patreon account. And we're now going to be joined by Mark Johnson from Big Brother Watch. Well, you come from a fine organisation. Thank you very much for joining us. Unsafe bill. Is it a threat to free speech? Is it a threat to privacy online? Give us the 101.
I think so. When you go through the rundown of what's in there, I mean, from the very top, you have the government deputising social media companies to act as online speech police. You have a new criminal offence which criminalises seriously distressing speech. You have the government delegating a category of free speech as harmful, or categories of free speech as harmful, and then you have all sorts of other mechanisms, private messaging, scanning, ID for internet access and so on. The list goes on, so it's certainly not a good bill for civil liberties at all.
Victoria, it seems to me that something being seriously distressing is intangible, and this discussion that we've been having, for example, someone who completely opposed to supply side reform might claim to have been seriously distressed by the views that you two have just expressed. What's your position?
Well, the new criminal offences are particularly worrying. Now, they do replace the existing communications offence, which are pretty terrible, and everyone was very delighted when reform and repeal of the communications offences under the old Section 127 of the Communications Act was up for grabs, but unfortunately it looks like it's going to be replaced with something that's in many ways worse. It's tied to the subjective experience of harm of the recipient or likely recipient if the sender intended to cause psychological harm to this likely audience. There's also the Mark will keep me right on this, the deliberately sending false information, so it's essentially a misinformation speech crime is being introduced. And why this is particularly damaging in this bill is that those social media companies will have a duty to remove material that they reasonably believe meets those the thresholds for those offences, without any due process, without a course investigation, without a judge, without particularly applying the normal protections and safeguards we'd expect for the prosecution of those offences in the real world. If in doubt, they will have to delete that kind of content, because otherwise they face fines and sanctions in the tens of millions of pounds potentially.
Well, Mark, there's a lot there I know that you and Big Brother Watch would agree with. The last time this government had a go at this, I confronted Michael Gove on libertarian points, and he said, I remember it because it was a good line, if a facile one, I used to be a libertarian and then I had children. Right? And the very patronising notion that if you have children, you no longer have beliefs that are freedom-minded. But the other side of this debate would say, wouldn't it, there's a lot of unpleasantness out there. People have a responsibility to look after and safeguard people. Even the Free Speech Union, I note, accepts big tech should do more to protect children online. Is there a different version of this bill you might support?
I think nobody disputes that what has to be done is the rule of law has to be upheld online, and that has to be the starting point for for any attempt to keep people safe or make people safer online. Where this bill obviously goes even further than that is it talks about harm to adults as well, and things that could be legal but harmful to adults. And in doing so, it gives the Secretary of State an enormous amount of power to decide what that could be, and then to push that onto the platforms and say, deal with it in a way that really will pressure them into censoring all kinds of material, as I said, that you or I could say or talk about in the street.
So are we moving to a situation where the minister, happens to be Nadine Dorries at the moment, but it could be any incumbent in the future, and you've got to imagine governments changing and
Absolutely.
different people occupying that role. Yeah. Are we saying that one minister will be able in the end to censor the population?
In effect, yeah. What the minister has to do is, or will be able to do, is to designate whichever category of speech or whichever type of speech that they deem to be subjectively harmful. That there is no safeguard around what that could be. There's a cyclical definition in the bill that says harm is something that could be harmful to adults, or something that could be physically or psychologically harmful to adults.
Yeah, that's tautological, isn't it?
And exactly, and so what could happen in effect is they could really choose anything in effect. And then they push this towards the platforms, and then the platforms have to deal with it, in their terms of use, which have to then be upheld consistently. What this will do is it could create political censorship, because if you think about, for example, going back to the COVID, to the pandemic and the lockdowns, big tech did get more censorious. We saw a kind of narrowing of the permissibility of speech on some of the main platforms that we all use. If there is a kind of moral panic about an area, for example, during the pandemic, we had back and forths on mask wearing. If the government decided to say that masks are effective, ineffective, take your pick, whatever, because we went in various different directions, then they could then push that onto the platforms and then say, actually, we don't like this is harmful speech and you've got to deal with it.
Alys, I know it's not necessarily a core focus for you, but you're going to have a view. What's the CPS position on this one?
Yeah, I'm very worried about the impact it's going to have on free speech, and you guys can correct me on this, but I thought one of the worrying aspects of it was that it turns a lot of small businesses, if you're just a company that has maybe a chat forum on your website, into a publisher. And so, obviously big tech is going to be a much better place to deal with this than perhaps a small community forum or indeed a kind of an innovator that's going to shake up the market. And I thought that was a really worrying aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think from your perspective, one of the big concerns is the kind of regulatory cost, but there's actually a freedom of expression consideration there, which is that, companies abroad might take a look at this and think, oh, we don't want to play ball with that.
Oh, it's interesting.
And
block the UK.
And not allow their services to be used in the UK. So you have a freedom of expression element there where people in the UK can't access sites and services abroad either.
Unless you get a VPN. Look out for the uptick in VPN.
So as so often you think actually the regulatory environment would just apply to those who choose to conform to it, and there'll be other people going around to a black market, and those clever enough to avoid the regulations would avoid them.
Which, let's be honest, is going to include most young people, teenagers, who will understand far better than their parents potentially how to get access to a VPN and use it in that way. And so, but yes, the impact assessment accompanying the bill estimates 25,000 platforms will be in scope. But some business organisations think that that's a massive underestimate.
Yes.
The government estimates the cost of compliance of the bill is going to be, in the first 10 years, £2.5 billion, which again is a deluded underestimate, because it includes, for example, an assumption that you'll be able to obtain legal advice at a cost of about £30 an hour.
Good luck finding a lawyer
which
to
is
do
a
that.
former specialist in that area is completely laughable. So there's a lot of dodgy stuff in the impact assessment and the cost-benefit analysis, quite apart from the qualitative questions about freedom of speech.
And Mark, before we lose you, I wanted to just try one other area that is plainly impacted on by this bill. Anonymity online, and that which comes with anonymity and ability to express yourself freely. Do you believe there's a right to be anonymous online? And whether or not there is a right to be anonymous online, would this bill end the ability to be anonymous online?
I think there's a risk that this bill will really damage the ability to be anonymous online, and I think it is an important thing that we are able to be anonymous if we choose to be. And there are loads of people in other jurisdictions who rely on that for their safety and security. But there are also people in this country that don't want to have their face to their words, and that's okay too, and it's a freedom of expression issue as much as it is a privacy issue.
Well, let's talk brass tacks. You have very different organisations, you have different perspectives, but one thing that unites you is you're all good Westminster watchers. I'm going to ask you, do you think the bill is a done deal? Alys?
I think it's still a way to go. It faces a lot of opposition. It's got,
Is it the Lords, do you think, that might come to the rescue? Mark?
I mean, I think there is certainly disquiet building on the Conservative benches, as you would probably expect. You've had people like David Davis, Lord Frost has been really outspoken recently, Steve Baker. So there is lots of opposition. It's growing. Whether the bill is a done deal or not, I'm not sure, but there's certainly a lot we can do to take out some of the most damaging bits, for sure.
Victoria, you're a good Tory whisperer. What do you reckon?
I'm not as optimistic as that. Unfortunately, the bill, certainly in the Commons, has very broad cross-party support. If anything, Labour members in particular don't think it goes far enough, because they want it to be able to be used to crack down quite explicitly on disinformation, climate change denial, incels. And so I think, if anything, it might even get worse as it progresses through Parliament. There is some hope that the Lords will bring a cooler heads and legal expertise to bear on it. But I fear that the bill is going to progress, even actually whatever happens, if there's a general election or whatever. I suspect a future Labour government or whatever form of coalition is going to be even more committed to it.
Well, it was Labour that gave us 28-day detention, control orders. They're hardly the party of liberty. Mark, without committing you to anything, observers will note that Big Brother Watch is a great success with legal interventions. Ultimately, this must be such a core issue for you guys. What are the plans?
It's something that we'll look at in time. At the moment, the battle is very much focused on the parliamentary fight, and as I said, I'm not resigned to it being over yet. I do think that that there is enough concern in quarters that we can pressure the government, maybe if not, by an outright rebellion, because as you said, Labour support might not be there. But I do think that there are ways in which we can fight some of the worst parts, and as you say, we always have our eye on strategic litigation further down the line. It
may just be me channeling my inner Littlewood, and indeed, in one view, hard to believe that he was a member of this party, given where it is now. But where are the Lib Dems? Shouldn't this be a core issue for the Liberal Democrats?
I actually can't remember anything that any Liberal Democrat has said on the matter, which is
Mark, you watch this one closely. Are they on side?
They have been quite quiet so far. I'm hoping that on some of the worst parts they may come to the fore. On the legal but harmful speech, I really do hope they oppose, and we will find out very soon, because report stage is coming up in the House of Commons probably before the recess.
Well, if you're a Liberal Democrat and you're watching this, contact your MP if you're in the unlikely circumstances of having a Liberal Democrat MP, and let them know that you care about them not saying anything on this subject. Alys, if we just broaden it from the online harms bill to think about government intervention more generally, this seems to me to be a high-tempo government in terms of its regulatory intervention into all aspects of life. Some people would be surprised, I think, by given it's a Conservative party doing that. What's your perspective?
Yeah, this is a sort of totally schizophrenic government, and there's kind of electoral reasons for that, because it has kind of opposing interests. It's got its heartlands in the south, traditional Tory values, what have you, and then a completely new set of interests in the Red Wall. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see, on the one hand, Rishi Sunak saying that he's this tax-cutting Conservative, while at the same time presiding over the highest tax burden since the days of Attlee. And I think perhaps that's why I kind of think that the whole levelling up agenda plays into this, because on the one hand, it's meant to be about a sort of protectionist view of kind of spreading wealth away from London, but then on the other hand, you can only get the wealth to do that by being kind of embracing the opportunities of Brexit to be much more free trading and open. So I think the government just has not resolved these internal tensions that it has, partly as a consequence of the manner in which it won the election, and I think partly as a consequence of the personalities involved. Prime Minister, who we know sort of, some describe as a shopping trolley, some say he sort of just agrees with whoever he last spoke to, but certainly a man who we don't consider necessarily as a guiding principle to his style of politics.
Victoria, high interventionist Toryism?
It's certainly that. I think there's, as I've been describing, is a lack of an organising principle. Because even on, for example, even on the issue of free speech, on the one hand, the same government is legislating to protect free speech in universities, and yet risking censorship of the exact same kinds of speech if it's uttered on a digital platform or in a WhatsApp message. So that's, completely arbitrary ad hoc behaviour.
Mark, that must be quite weird for you as a free speech warrior. The government is fighting its best to ensure free speech in universities, but if you stick the speech online, you open yourself up to liability.
I think there was a government minister asked about, a particularly difficult area which you're often, presented with when you're talking about free speech, and they almost did say, okay in universities, not okay online, and it, is mind-boggling. But it is a government that talks a very good game on free speech. But you can look at other areas as well as as to where they're really shutting down free expression. I mean, we've had a lot of concerns about the PCSC, the Police Crime Sentencing in Courts Now Act, and the restrictions around protests which cause too much noise. And you can look at that from a freedom of expression perspective, literally.
But surely even Big Brother Watch must be relieved to see the back of
Steve Bray.
No,
You're that committed. You're diehard.
Je suis Steve Bray.
Steve Bray is very annoying, but I don't think being annoying should face criminal sanctions.
There speaks a true liberal in the actual meaning of the word liberal. Great note to lose you on. Thanks for coming up and talking to us about that. And we're going to be joined now by Chris Snowdon.
Hello.
Thank you very much. We will first of all point out, I know many of our viewers were expecting you to be Patrick Christys. Patrick Christys has done something very silly. He was in a tractor race, or lawnmower race, forgive me, and fell off it and did himself an injury. As the injury isn't too bad, we gather, it's all right to laugh at him. And I therefore look forward to appending the footage from that accident to this show notes when they go out. Chris, let's think about some of the topics we've been discussing with the panel tonight. First of all, general position on strikes, disorder, where we are as a country, a long, hot summer of discontent. I'll keep talking whilst you get a microphone pinned to yourself. I wonder what your perspective is, not just because you're here at the IEA, but also because the lifestyle unit sees so much that is being intruded upon in some of this stuff, whether it be alcohol, gambling, smoking, so forth. You must see lots of reasons for people to be cross, but it seems they're actually cross about their wages.
Yeah, rightly so. I mean, in a way, I'm sanguine about it because I had my crisis 2 years ago when I saw all this coming, around about May, June 2020, and I'm watching it unfold. And it's a little bit worse than I expected because of the war in Ukraine, making things worse. But you've got to pay the fiddler at some point, and the way that the government has decided to pay for COVID is through inflation, which is. It has all the effects of a tax, but worse, in fact, I would say. What do I think about the strikes? I can totally understand why people are striking. I can totally understand why people don't want to see their living standards fall. But what do you do when you have inflation at 10%? There isn't any easy answer to it. There isn't any easy solution to it. Either you drive the country into recession, which will work, and that's generally been the way that these problems have been dealt with, but that leads to a fall in living standards. You jack up interest rates, which has obviously massive negative effects in various ways and also will probably lead to a recession. Or you kind of freeze wages, and people in the private sector certainly won't be getting 10, 11% pay rises. It would be nice, obviously, if we all could get 10, 11% pay rises in theory in the short term, but then what happens next year? We're just back in the same situation again.
Your fellow panellists have taken the position that there are a couple of professions, at least, in which people effectively shouldn't be allowed to strike. That withdrawal of your labour, one example was in the law courts being ground to a halt, another was in the medical profession and people not being able to have an operation. I'm going to have one last go to see if there is a libertarian perspective on withdrawal of labour from the IEA. What's your view?
I would limit that to the army and the police myself.
So two more. Okay, there we go.
No, I would limit. I would limit it to it. I think doctors should be allowed to strike. What was the other one?
The courts.
Yeah, they should be absolutely allowed to strike.
Well, all right. So we've got a different perspective. I should allow you the right of reply. Actually, Alys first.
I would just say that Lord Burnett is very senior. Judge has disagreed. He says it's unprofessional for barristers to go on strike and they should be referred for misconduct proceedings.
I've never heard of him. I don't care what he thinks.
There's
no point trying to appeal to authority.
I have heard of him and I don't care what he thinks either.
So I definitely think, of course, you're free to withdraw your labour. That's clear. People aren't in indentured servitude, but the government or whoever the employer or service provider is should also be free to hire alternative labour, temporary supply contractors, whatever it is. So of course you can walk away and withdraw your labour, but you should expect your employer to try and mitigate that, and potentially for your job not to be there when you decide to return.
I mean, I think there's a better case with barristers and judges than there is with doctors, because the police, the army and barristers all have to work for the state. I think even a fairly extreme libertarian would agree with that. Doctors shouldn't be working for the state at all. Doctors should be negotiating with their own, whatever it is, GP surgery, hospital, with their own employer. They shouldn't be working, the NHS shouldn't exist, and they shouldn't have to be negotiating with it, and we'd be in a much better system
But surely there's a market solution to paying criminal barristers. Alex, you probably have better ideas on this, but it seems to me the problem here is the inefficiencies in our legal aid system. which means that barristers de facto are working for the state, even though in fact really they're working for their clients. It's just the state is paying for them.
They're self-employed, but whether they're prosecuting or defending, in the end, I don't think any of us would want someone, if they were poor enough, not to be able to be represented. And if that's the case, then the state's going to have to provide some form of de minimis provision, and that de minimis provision is legal aid. So Chris, in the end, I think, has got a point. But Alys, your thoughts on the examples that Chris gave? Because he's probably right, isn't he, that the army shouldn't be allowed to withdraw their labour, nor should the police. So that we've got 4 at least workforces now that you'd compel to do their work.
Yeah, I absolutely resent pretty much anyone going on strike. But, and I couldn't agree with Chris more. We shouldn't have an NHS. And that would solve many of our problems.
It's good that we can agree on a sensible middle ground.
So, yes, of course. Change of topic. What a fortnight it's been in Westminster. I've got 3 inveterate Westminster watchers with me. It would be foolish not to ask you your perspectives on the state of the parties, and especially government, which has just lost 2 by-elections. Why don't I start with Victoria and work down this way? Victoria, where are we in political life? Where are we in party politics?
Well, the by-elections were obviously widely predicted as being well, although they've been spun, haven't they? Some people are saying, oh, it's not actually as bad as it looks because some complicated methodology shows that it's actually all fine. But I'm not sure I buy that. From my perspective, actually, from the policy areas that I'm interested in, with the interesting knock-on effect that all this is having with the Prime Minister's insecurity in his position, is that he is being driven by certain interest groups within Parliament to pursue their priorities, which the one I'm particularly interested in and following is the Northern Ireland Protocol, where does the Prime Minister's insecurity mean that he's very much going to be once again beholden to the ERG and the DUP in pursuing the Northern Ireland Protocol bill, which I would welcome. I think the bill is positive and needed, and so I sort of almost hope the Prime Minister clings on for long enough to see that through. So that's one interesting sort of policy impact of the current Westminster arithmetic.
Chris, your perspective on the state of things?
Dire, obviously. Fairly dire for the Conservative Party. I honestly don't know. The mid-term by-elections, obviously, you expect the government to lose. And in a way, it's a miracle that anybody votes for the government, particularly in Wakefield, right? I mean, what an absolute... It'd never been Tory for like 87 years or something like that.
Yeah.
The previous MP had just been convicted for being a pedo.
No, he's not. Well, a sexual assault on a child.
That's the same thing.
No, it's not. Forgive me. It's not the same thing because it wasn't the definition of a child. It was someone over 13. So I think it was on a young person. It's not a paedophile. But anyway.
Okay, he was convicted of having sex with a child.
It wasn't sex either. I'm just thinking. I'm mindful of the IEA's liability. I'm not defending the guy. Yeah, I'm not defending the guy. I'm thinking about the IEA's liability.
It was sexual assault on a minor.
Sexual assault on a minor. Yeah.
It's not an attractive position.
No, it's not. You should be representing him as a barrister.
The Tory candidate was asked, I blush to say it as a member of the Tory party, was asked, your predecessor is in prison, why should people vote for you? And his response was, well, Harold Shipman went to prison, but people still trust GPs. Okay. Slightly better than Harold Shipman. Vote for us.
Indeed, and he didn't do too well, did he? So both of these people lost the by-election. I don't know how much to read into it. And the reason I don't is because I genuinely don't care about Partygate. And I find it really hard to believe that people do. And I find it really hard to believe that certainly in 2 years' time they will. But I could well be wrong. My finger is not always on the pulse of the nation by any means. I just don't know. I don't know if they have a plausible candidate to replace Boris Johnson. He is a guy who tends to bounce back, but I'm reading so much stuff saying that he can't, and that on the doorstep he's completely finished. So I don't know. I think the Tory party will probably give him another 11 months or so, by which time they'll know. But the state of the country alone, in terms of inflation, strikes and all that, is enough to put any party way down in the polls, and he's not that far down in the polls.
No.
You know, single figures we're talking.
Alys, you are going to leave us soon, I know, so parting shots, positions on party politics?
Well, I do think Partygate matters a lot to people because people really remember what they were doing during the pandemic, what they suffered, what they gave up. But I think there are two things that play in the Prime Minister's favour here. One, that he's kind of already taken the hit from that, and two, that a lot of people think that Keir Starmer was doing it as well, that they're all as bad as each other. That kind of, in some ways, helps Boris Johnson. I think one of the intriguing features of our politics at the moment is that the sort of most popular person for Prime Minister at the moment is don't know. And I mean, I think a lot of Tories should be looking at that polling and think, would we be better off with basically anyone except for Boris? People always talk about, oh, there's no alternative. There's no obvious successor, but I think pollster James Johnson, who I spoke to recently, said they'd be better off with literally anyone. So I think Tories should think about that. That's not a Centre for Policy Studies position. But
No,
once he's gone, you can't get him back. Once you just put some rando in there, and you find out actually Boris Johnson's the most popular Tory in the last 30 years, you can't suddenly go, oh, actually, can you come back?
You can't suddenly, but people do occasionally return in political life. But I take your point. Alys, you've been a great guest. Thank you so much. Don't forget your wine.
Thank you for having me. I won't.
And as we lose Alys, my guests shuffle up. We're going to be talking about the fundamentals. Is the government justified in the end by focusing on the fundamentals and saying they get the big calls right? You often hear this defence, don't you, of the government and of particularly the Prime Minister, that he may do X or Y or Z that you don't like, but in the end, look at, and you choose your things, Ukraine, if that's something that appeals to the audience, coronavirus, if that's the one that appeals to the audience, and so forth. So he gets the big decisions right. Victoria, I think I might know what your view is, but what's your view on that?
Well, I think in a lot of ways they've got those big decisions quite wrong. We've talked about economic policy. I can't really think of any economic policy decisions that I would say have been resoundingly right. I think Boris Johnson, and this is where Chris and I will probably diverge, I think Boris Johnson was right at first about the response to coronavirus and then was sort of sat on by the science and locked us down. Ukraine, yes, potentially. I'm not really a foreign policy person, but I'm happy to assume that we are on the right side and doing the right things. So yes, I suppose there's that. Culture wars, I would probably say actually the government is doing the right thing, putting the online safety bill to one side, but you know the Equalities Minister Liz Truss has sort of cracked down on some of the more wild sort of gender ideology that is being propagated within government. And the Prime Minister himself seemed to take quite a sound position that women do not, in fact, generally or at all have penises, which is great news. So let's.
It was once an uncontroversial position.
It used to be a fairly uncontroversial position, but I would say on that the Prime Minister has definitely got the big call right.
Chris, on the big issues?
I think the big call he got right was, Freedom Day, nearly a year ago now. Now, the lockdown went on longer than I wanted, longer certainly than you wanted. But we've had a year, basically, of freedom, apart from a bit of token mask wearing in January or something like that. And I think things would have been a lot worse with anybody else in charge, and indeed were worse around Europe, and partly that's because of the vaccine.
Before you move on from that, you often, IEA watchers will know, you often get into the mix with the ultras who say that basically we should never have had any kinds of restrictions, and I wanted to give you an opportunity on the show to kind of set out your stall on measures that the government did that were right or not, and why there are conspiracy theorists on all sides of these things, and you puncture them magnificently online, so over to you.
Well, I mean, COVID is quite a serious disease that kills 1% of people, and would kill more than 1% of people if they didn't get hospital treatment. It does transmit from human to human, and if you reduce human to human transmission, then you will get the disease to go into retreat. I think we were right to have the lockdown in March 2020, although I think it went on far too long. I think we were right to have the lockdown in January 2021, although it went again on for far too long. And also, I think it's kind of inevitable, because I think it's kind of almost stupid to argue about it. It was always going to happen. There was no way. Look around the world. You know, virtually every government did have a lockdown when they saw their hospital system virtually collapsing under this. So, I think I take a relatively moderate position on this. But as I say, I'm very pleased that Boris Johnson did get rid of this stuff. We, along with Javid, they're not keen on introducing it. There's panic again, even now that cases are going up. There was panic a few months ago. They're not interested in bringing back restrictions. I personally think that's great, and I think they should get more credit for it than they do.
That's a very fair point. Different subject, but because it's so topical and since the last show, the Northern Ireland Protocol bill just passed a second reading. Now, for a government that's faced all these challenges, I note no rebellions. Victoria?
Yes, I think I was surprised how comfortably that passed. I'm not sure whether Theresa May voted for it in the end. I thought there was an interesting article today by Arlene Foster, wrote an article in the Daily Express, the former First Minister of Northern Ireland, who had a really big go at Theresa May, who said basically that she had stood up and given a speech opposing the Northern Ireland Protocol bill, and Arlene Foster described that as Theresa May bringing her usual impotent sanctimoniousness to bear, and if the Prime Minister's basically, if you're on the other side of Theresa May on this, you're on the right side, was Arlene Foster's view, which was quite punchy. And, I get frustrated with the discourse on the Northern Ireland Protocol, because everyone seems to say, oh, well, we need a negotiated solution. Well, OK, but the EU's not negotiating. What are you going to do? And the same people who a year or so ago were calling for full rigorous implementation are now saying, oh, well, actually, we didn't really mean very full and very rigorous. We're quite happy with the grace periods that are currently in operation. That's sort of mitigating the worst aspects because we haven't fully imposed full third country border controls, which is what the EU wants and is what full rigorous implementation would mean. Well, but all those people need to realise the grace periods are currently in breach of the agreement. So are you going to be a purist about international law and get rid of the grace periods as well? So I think there's a lot of hypocrisy and, dare I say, sanctimony going on here. And ultimately, the British government has a duty to protect the interests of all its citizens, including the economic interests and indeed the constitution of the United Kingdom,
of those in Ulster.
Northern Ireland.
And Chris, you've just been very fair to the government on the one hand. Do you think the government on this has got the right approach? Green lanes and red lanes, taking a new position in Westminster at odds with what they negotiated with Brussels?
To be perfectly honest with you, Alex, I don't know anything about it.
Excellent.
I'm a specialist more than a generalist. This is why I don't get invited to go on Sky Papers.
But there are lots of lifestyle goods going into Northern
Whatever
Ireland.
Victoria said, I agree with.
Well, fair enough. Fair enough. Let's try something different with you then.
Ask me about the nanny status.
That's what I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you whether the discussion that we had about the online harms bill resonated with you. Big Brother Watch has a particular perspective, which doesn't matter, and I might happen to share it, but you might take a different point of view. After all, you've just displayed admirable moderation in your position about the government's position on coronavirus, when some will have been pushing, come on IEA, come on Chris Snowdon, be more on our side, be more allegedly freedom-minded, or be more anti-vax. What's your position on the online harms stuff?
I think it's terrible. I think the whole legislation's awful from start to finish. From what I understand of it, I would get rid of the restrictions on free speech in the broader society, let alone online. I don't think it should be a crime to be grossly offensive, for example.
Does that mean that you would get rid of the hate crime legislation that we have?
Yes, absolutely. Hate crime legislation is appalling. I mean, it's thought crime legislation, really. Hate crime is a funny thing because, well, it's not a funny thing, but it's an odd thing because when it first started out, it was about things such as racist physical assaults.
Yes.
Right? That was considered to be a hate crime.
Or incitements to riots and violent
that kind of
attacks.
thing. Whether an assault should be punished more harshly because it was racially motivated or motivated by homophobia, so I'm not quite sure it should be. It seems to me that if you kill somebody, it doesn't really matter what the motivation was. It seems that probably quite a bit of hate was involved, regardless. But now it's gone even beyond that, and it's just about speech. It's sinister and Orwellian, and I absolutely despise it. And I don't like anything in the online harms bill. And I think we need to have a First Amendment, basically, in this country.
What about the, this is up your strata, I think, if you travel around Europe, especially now that we've left, it's noticeable. The tax on a lot of consumables, whether it be on alcohol or tobacco or fuel, is a great deal lower amongst some of our immediate neighbours than it is here in the UK. The government might say it's the wrong time to be cutting tax on things, and indeed some of the some people who urge more regulation say that you tax something more to discourage someone from using it. What's your position on that, given the rise of the cost of living and what people are spending in tax with money they've already been taxed on?
Well, yeah, we're in, like I said before, we're in an impossible situation and there's no easy way out of it. And yes, you can try cutting taxes, you can try just giving people money. The government is giving people money, it's giving everybody hundreds of pounds. That's already been forgotten about, by the way. You know, the population is totally ungrateful for all these things. It's cost, I think, about 30 or 40 billion pounds. It's already been forgotten about. Why isn't the government doing anything about the cost of living? 30, 40 billion pounds, you know, we're giving you a cheque. Yeah, so you can give people money or you can reduce taxes. The economic effects of it are basically the same. It just means the government has to borrow more money. And we've got high inflation largely because the government's been borrowing printed money to a whopping degree for 2 or 3 years. So I would obviously favour tax cuts rather than giving people money, partly because it stimulates growth, but also in the case of VAT and fuel duty, because you are literally bringing down prices if you reduce those taxes. Excise taxes, VAT, you reduce the tax, you reduce the prices, so you are directly tackling inflation.
Victoria, this is a lot of that stuff is your core area of economic expertise, and I wonder what you think about it in that consumables and consumer-facing point, especially when, if you do get a tax cut, some of the providers don't pass it on.
Well, yes, I mean, another crazy sort of knee-jerk idea that the government has had is to investigate petrol stations for not passing on reductions in the price in the oil prices. So I'm a little bit sceptical of that. I would rather trust the free market to deal with that over a period of time, because let's face it, the providers, the vendors of these goods and services have their own costs and overheads that they need to also reflect in the price. You know, energy prices is a huge driver of inflation. So all of these suppliers of goods and services are suffering as well, wages. So I'm not sure we can necessarily blame the sellers of goods and services for not automatically passing any reduction in fuel duty or a cut in the oil price, because business is hard for everyone.
Can I ask you a question about that point you just made about the free market? Because you mentioned it in the context of energy prices. And it occurs to me that actually we don't really have a free market in energy prices, because we have a price cap, and everyone, such as the cost of the material currently, everyone charges up to the cap. So on the one hand, there is no real competition and there's no free market. On the other hand, if you were to unleash the forces of the free market, I dare say many consumers wouldn't be thanking you. So what's your position on that?
Well, we haven't had a free market in domestic retail energy prices for a long time, certainly since Theresa May's price cap. But even before that, there were so many interventions, subsidies, regulations, that it was a very distorted market. The price cap had already been a failure because of that clustering effect that you just mentioned. So I sort of agree in a sentence that removing the price cap now might have worse effects, because the market is so broken that it needs to, the reforms to the energy market needs to be more than simply removing the price cap. It needs to be a root and branch review to actually recreate the sort of market in the utilities that the Thatcher era and subsequent reforms actually had in mind.
Chris, should we have price caps? What's the IEA perspective?
Well, no, we shouldn't do. But also, I have to say, I don't think we should be having energy sanctions on Russia. They're being totally counterproductive. The oil, we're paying £2 a litre now for petrol and diesel. Russia's never made more money out of oil. It's not working. The Russians are just selling it to the likes of China, who are selling it on to somebody else.
Or selling it to India, who's selling it on to us.
Exactly. So it's not working. It's fair enough trying it. I can understand why they wanted to do it. I want to punish Russia as much as the next man. But it's not working. And when something doesn't work and is absolutely counterproductive and is impoverishing you while enriching your enemy, surely you just go, well, we're going to stop doing this, right? And I hate to use the word virtue signalling, but that's the only reason at this point to do that.
Doesn't that virtue signalling seem particularly weird when the Germans are still directly giving the Russians money with Nord Stream 1?
Right, yeah. I mean, but how much do you want to cut off your nose to spite your face?
Well, the Germans have done, arguably what we should have done, which is protect the interests of their own citizens and businesses first and foremost. As Chris says, we want to sanction Russia, of course we do, but I'm not sure it's fair to do that at the expense of the poorest people in our own country.
Especially if it's not working.
Especially if it's not even working.
It's having the opposite effect.
This is very interesting because I have in my hand some polling from citizens of the members of the G7 countries who voted that Britain's response to the Ukraine situation was the best of the responses that's been offered by the Western powers. It seems to me you're disagreeing with that, actually, at least on this point.
Well, perhaps they more had in mind shipping them weapons to defend themselves rather than anything else. I mean, there has been, I dare say, people were quite glad in a slightly worrying populist way to see the Russian oligarchs punished and Abramovich getting his comeuppance, which I'm also a little bit uncomfortable about, I must say. So perhaps that contributes as well to the positive response in the polling.
Yeah, just to wrap things up on Ukraine, Chris, what's your perspective on that idea that the government in the end gets judged by, because I cut you off when you were talking about coronavirus response. A lot of people would defend the government by saying the biggest, most important call is the response to Ukraine, and they've basically got it right. Is that a contention you accept?
Yeah, well, I think the UK did better than any other country. I mean, Zelensky seems to say that. Maybe he says that to everyone, I don't know.
No, I think he'd get caught if he did. I think it would be quite obvious if he did say
it's a great response, but, it just involves spending a huge amount of money. Boris Johnson's very good at spending a huge amount of money. So the response to COVID is considered a great success. And when I say the response to COVID, I don't mean what I was talking about having freedom earlier than the rest of Europe. I mean, locking us down. If you look at the polls, the peak in Boris Johnson's popularity is always we're in the middle of lockdown. Yes. Mm-hmm. And as soon as we're out of lockdown, it goes straight down again.
And now
we're not going to be in lockdown again. It's never been worse, So, what do you people want out there? What do you want?
Well, I want to thank my panel, both those who are still here and those who've just left us, and I want to thank you at home for watching. We're going to be back in a fortnight for another great show with me as Mark's stunt double. I'd like you to like and subscribe on the YouTube channel. And just one more thing. Mark can't say this because he's employed by the IEA, but I'm not, so I can. Financially supporting the Institute of Economic Affairs is one of the best things you can do to promulgate freedom and the free markets in this country. That's why I personally contribute financially to the IEA, and that's why I'm asking you to do that tonight. I want to give big thanks to the top-tier IEA online patrons: Andrew Hunt, Donald Blaney, James Burns, Mark Edwards, Philip Ozouf, Richard Leader, Robert Appleby and Timothy Worrell. And I'd like you to join them thanks to watching this show. And if you want to support content like this, please check out our Patreon account. Go to patreon.com/IEA London or email us here at the IEA. And until next time, thank you very much for watching Live Without Littlewood.